Welcome to In and Around War, a podcast of the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights on contemporary issues related to wars.
Greetings to everyone and welcome to the first episode of our new season of In and Around Wars to discuss contemporary issues related to armed conflict. My name is Eugenie Duss. I am a research fellow at the Geneva Academy, and today I'm very pleased to welcome Zeith, legal advisor on Arms and Conduct of Hostilities Unit at the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, and Zeitoun, Director General of the Geneva Water Hub and Professor of Water Diplomacy at the Geneva Graduate Institute. We are recording this podcast in the studio of the Geneva Graduate Institute, one of our parent institutions, and we'll continue the conversation we start at our last IHL talk on the weaponizing of water in contemporary armed conflicts. Abby and Mark, thank you so much for coming today. And before we start, Abby, you may want to tell us a bit more about you. In particular, how did you end up to work on the protection of water in armed conflict?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's a delight to be back and chatting about the protection of water in armed conflict. My role at the ICRC at the moment is working as a legal advisor in our arms and conduct of hostilities units, focusing primarily on urban warfare and the conduct of hostilities more generally. I've been in that role for about almost 4 years, and then I've had a couple of other roles at the ICRC, working in the thematic legal advisors unit and for their delegation in New York. And then prior to coming to the ICRC, I spent about 10 years in the Australian Army, primarily. First started as a signals officer, and then I was a legal officer. So I've really always had a very strong interest in the international humanitarian law, and always worked on issues related to the protection of civilians from various angles. And so that's how I've ended up at the ICRC, working on the protection of water. I mean, for us at the ICRC, it has been an issue that we have worked on for decades. It's one of our institutional priorities is the protection of essential services, including water. And a lot of folks at the ICRC are working on this issue from various different angles, both in our delegations, in situations of armed conflict, at the diplomatic level, and across the globe.
Thank you. And turning to you, Mark, to which extent your background as a civilian engineer influenced you to become a renowned expert on water-related issues?
Yeah, well, looking back on it, it always seems much more joined up than it actually was. But I think there were a couple of pivotal moments. I was trained and worked as a civil engineer, taught how to pour concrete to stop rivers, and dam them and what have you. And then I went into environmental engineering because I thought we could do slightly better than that, and became quickly fascinated by just how much men usually will ruin water systems in war. So worked with the International Committee of the Red Cross and others for several years, repairing the damage that other people had done to water systems. Got tired of chasing and putting Band-Aids on, so I went and did a PhD with the late, great Tony Allen, who taught me how to begin to think about how to understand water conflicts and conflicts over water with a view of being able to prevent them. And so then worked and did a lot of research for that for about 12 years at the University of East Anglia, and then wanted to get even more influential in the policy world. And so now become Director General of the Geneva Water Hub, which is all about using water for peace. So very much a turn from the hard to the soft.
Thank you. And I think this leads to another question. What role can play an engineer in the assessment of the targeting in the conduct of hostilities?
Yeah, well, engineers have a lot to contribute, I think, for targeting, or for what not to target at least. I firmly believe that no water systems should suffer any damage, much less be targeted. And, a very practical way for that is to have the intelligence when you're preparing your battle plans. Abby can speak a lot more eloquently to this. People who are going to target for military objectives would look out for are discernible patterns of, especially the easiest thing is big water infrastructure. So big water treatment plants have a certain predictable look. Wastewater, sewage treatment plants have a predictable look. Often big water transmission lines are identifiable through satellite imageries, and certainly with the reconnaissance that most militaries have.
Abby, does this framework ask for engineers to be more involved in the targeting assessment?
It's a very good question, and I think if we sort of take it back to the legal framework that exists, we talk about the protection of water and the provision of water as an essential service to civilians. But I think it's important to bear in mind that in order to ensure the provision of water to the civilian population, you don't just need the infrastructure itself, you need the people and the consumables that are necessary for the functioning of that service, and the people that you need to repair and maintain it. And Mark can speak much more eloquently to the types of people and the consumables that are needed in that space. But IHL provides very strong protections to those people, the consumables and the infrastructure that's needed for the provision of water. There is, of course, the general principles on the conduct of hostilities under IHL. Most folks know that the principle of distinction, proportionality and precautions are especially important. And then there are also some specific protections that are afforded to certain water infrastructure under the rule protecting objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population. And so here we can think of drinking water installations and supplies and irrigation works. But also that rule protects other infrastructure that's critical for the functioning of other indispensable objects. So certain types of energy infrastructure, which is absolutely fundamental to ensure electricity can treat water in a way that's actually safe to give to the civilian population. So that's one aspect of IHL that really protects water in that sense. But then there's also other rules related to the works and installations containing dangerous forces like dams, dikes, and nuclear power plants. I won't go into the detail of those rules, but essentially, they are about trying to avoid that, these types of infrastructure, becomes a battleground and incidentally or damaged by the fighting or directly targeted. And then there are other really important rules on, related to the weapons, the use and restrictions on weapons, and then the protection of the natural environment, which is fundamental when protecting water. So there is a very strong legal framework. Now, your question sort of is more about, well, how do we ensure that legal framework is effectively implemented in practice and what's needed in that respect? And absolutely one of the things that the ICRC advocates for, along with a lot of other organisations, including Geneva Water Hub, is that making sure that the right people are around the table when it comes to planning military operations, all the way from the strategic level down to the tactical level. So it goes beyond targeting in that sense. It's absolutely fundamental that you have a well thought out targeting process and you've got risk mitigations baked into that process. But well before you're in the operational environment, you have the right experts, be it engineers, cultural advisors, lawyers, logisticians, even medical planners around the table to help advise the commander that, what is how do all of the essential services function within the area of operations? What are its risks from the fighting? How do you mitigate those risks? And so, engineers are the ones that are going to be able to identify a lot of the infrastructure that, say, for example, the lawyer can't. And that's absolutely fundamental when it comes to, making decisions whether to put certain infrastructure on target lists or no strike lists and the like. So it's and we say a very similar thing about environmental experts as well, because so much of the protection of water is related to, the natural environment, but not everybody is an expert in the environmental consequences of certain activities, such as, for example, explosive remnants of war, the release of toxic industrial chemicals after targeting certain industrial infrastructure. So yes, it's absolutely fundamental to have those experts feeding into any kind of decision cycle at all levels of operations when it's possible.
So we just discussed water being a target or a victim of armed conflict, but water has been used also as a weapon in the history. And it's still the case. But could you tell us what is different now in contemporary armed conflict? What are today's challenges with water being used as a weapon?
I'm not sure that there's much difference between the way we use water as a weapon now and the way that it's been used throughout wars in history. If you look at the historical record, there are plenty of examples of using rivers or water for different military objectives. So for instance, Leonardo da Vinci drew up plans, very beautiful plans, about diverting the Arno River away from Pisa, for example. The Belgian troops in World War I knew how to operate the weirs of the trenches to flood out the German invaders at that point. Because water is such a valuable resource and so precious, people need it so badly that people will go to collection points, and snipers know that. So snipers will wait by water collection points and wait for the men or the pregnant women who are sent out to collect the water. So it can be used for that. Water can be used for ethnic cleansing too. Again, in former Yugoslavia, this was used quite effectively, where they would throw bodies down the household wells so that the families who had fled the fighting wouldn't return. I saw very similar things in southern Lebanon when a lot of, in 2006, when a lot of public reservoirs were pierced. And then you can always bomb dams to create floods. That's another way of creating floods, like the dam busters did, the British in World War II. On the Ruhr River especially, they were successful a couple times. Successful in the sense that they ended up flooding an industrial zone of Germany and killing several thousand, mostly Russian prisoners of war that Germany had taken, mostly women and children, as it turns out. And then there are other ways to not just clear the killing fields, but for ethnic cleansing, to get rid of one type of people. For instance, I would say in the West Bank, where water is denied to the Palestinian villagers who have been there for hundreds of years, but water is provided to the Israeli settlers who come to the land recently, with a very specific political military objective in that case. And so what you see today, I mean, look at Ukraine, there's destruction of dams, there's diversion of rivers. Look at Gaza, poisoning of aquifers, denial of water to most of the population. And it's all part of a long, I would say, black history that is very much with us in the present.
Mark, during the event you mentioned that more research is needed on the weaponizing of water. Why and on which particular issue?
First of all, it would be interesting to see how water has been used as a military objective. And once we classify it and take it much deeper, then we could know, is water actually that effective as a military objective? If it's not objective, then we could begin to think of imposing bans on the use of water as a weapon, just like landmines, right? One of the reasons the ban on landmines more or less worked was that it was counterproductive for military objectives. If you lay landmines somewhere and then take that territory, then it's a problem for you. So if water is not a great military objective, then rather, conduct the war through weapons, as most people do. But if water is, an effective military tool, then I would say that research could also support campaigns to minimize the damage, if not outright ban, which I would still call for. Then at least to minimize the damage to water systems and to people. So if you begin to understand that even indirect damage, so collateral damage to a water system, has reverberating effects on people, because a pumping station stops working, so there's less water in the hospital, and the surgeon's equipment isn't sterilized properly, so there's more infections. And if the sewage also isn't working, the sewage treatment plants aren't also working, then there's a greater risk of the contamination, of the spread of waterborne and other diseases. All of this needs to be understood so that we can minimize that impact, because the more that we know, the more we can say that we know. And that's where it feeds into the rules of war, the laws of armed combat, because as I understand it, as a non-lawyer, we have to factor in the reasonably foreseeable impact of an attack or damage to a particular water system on people's health or on the environment. So long as it's reasonably foreseeable, it has to be taken into account during the planning stages of the attack. Now, I would also emphasize that our biggest concern with the use of water as a weapon, or even damage to water systems, and why we think it shouldn't happen at all, is precisely mainly because of the damage, the waterborne diseases. So when water and sewage mix and there's a bit of cholera in the region, then it can spread like wildfire. And very quickly, 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 people will be dead. And it won't be even attributed to the armed conflict, but we know it is because of the armed conflict. And so these reverberating effects endure long after the dust has settled and well beyond the blast zone, probably beyond the minds of the people who fired the weapons in the first place. And I think research that allows everyone that exposes that makes it common knowledge that these reverberating effects are so devastating for so long, can only help push in that direction to minimize. Basically, the ultimate objective is to reduce the civilian harm.
And Abby, maybe in relation with the reverberating impact of attack on water infrastructures, the repetition of attack will also have an influence on that. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Absolutely. I think it's probably, before I do, I guess important for me to sort of clarify, I guess, how the ICRC sees, this idea of water as a weapon of war, or the weaponization of water. I think because a lot of what we see is, the deprivation of water as a tactic or a strategy of war. Indeed, as some of the examples that Mark referred to, weapons or water can be a means of warfare, such as when it's being used to kill and destroy. If you're flooding a plain, for example, when an enemy battalion is present. But a lot of the time, it's because there are actions being taken as part of a belligerent strategy to deprive water to the civilian population. And in that sense, the law is quite strong in terms of saying that's not a legitimate tactic from a military perspective, because there is a very clear prohibition on starvation, which, as its corollary, there is a prohibition on attacking, destroying, removing, or rendering useless those objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population, which includes certain water infrastructure. And so this idea that, depriving civilian populations of water as part of a warring strategy just simply doesn't hold weight today. Now, that is different from, the law foresees the possibility to starve combatants and including starving them of water. But in many cases where armed conflict takes place today, you cannot separate combatants from civilians, and it's nearly impossible to exclusively direct your operations against combatants if you are using starvation as a tactic, starvation of combatants, that is. So it's very difficult to square the circle with existing rules. Moving to your specific question on attacks, which is one of the very common things that we always see, is attacks against infrastructure that is necessary for the functioning or the provision of water. And one of the things that we constantly say, when talking about, the principle of proportionality as well as precautions in attack, is that you must take into account the direct and indirect effects that are going to be caused that will amount to a loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, or destruction to civilian objects. And so that's those consequences that are not the direct, that sort of area of impact directly caused by a munition, but it's also those second and third order or reverberating effects that are likely to occur. So the more, as Mark said, the more that you know about your area in which you're operating as a party to armed conflict, the more you are likely to be able to predict the consequences of your actions and then mitigate them. And the law requires you to do so. And particularly if you are operating within urban and other densely populated areas, and if you're using heavy explosive weapons, which have a significant impact or cause significant harm in armed conflicts across the globe, as we've seen, you are very likely to be causing reverberating effects to a massive extent. And we say, and this is why the ICRC for a very long time, along with other organizations, have been, advocating for belligerents to avoid the use of heavy explosive weapons in populated areas, unless sufficient mitigation measures can be taken to reduce the risk of civilian harm caused by those weapons, just simply because the reverberating effects are so extensive in populated areas when you use them. But recently the international community, approximately 85 states have endorsed a landmark political declaration on explosive weapons in populated areas. And as part of that declaration, they have committed to doing more to take into account reverberating effects that are reasonably foreseeable during your planning and conduct of attacks, as well as after attacks, taking them into account into your various battle damage assessments and after-action reviews. So there is a lot of focus in the international, community. States are increasingly recognizing these challenges and committing to doing better. And now there's a sort of, an impetus to keep pushing forward on that together and sharing expertise and exchanging good practices to improve the situation.
Thank you very much. And a last question to both of you, to end on the positive note, at least we try. Do you have any positive development, good practice, initiative, or example to share with us?
I'm encouraged by, the Geneva Water Hub is leading with Switzerland and Slovenia an alliance to better protect water during armed conflict and sanctions. We don't know where exactly this is going, but there's a lot of interest. I think, if you were to ask the average person, should water be spared from armed conflict, the answer would be yes. And hopefully people are getting more and more passionate about that. I sense also from what we see, the intense level of destruction, misery and suffering, dehydration, death by dehydration in Gaza, also should push us in that direction. So I'm encouraged by the fact that there's a lot of support to stop the use of water as a weapon of war and to better protect water during armed conflict. And certainly looking forward to harnessing that energy, to make what's going on today no longer acceptable.
Abby, would you like to add something?
I think really just to reiterate what I said before about that political declaration on explosive weapons in populated areas, really that was a huge achievement adopted in 2022 by all of those states. But really now is the time to see implementation and to see those commitments made into meaningful change at the policy level as well as within militaries. And those commitments require resources and they require prioritization and dedication to making sure that they are effectively implemented. And so I think, but it is, as Mark said, incredibly encouraging because there is more and more people talking about these issues. There's a number of great organizations looking at the linkages between a number of issues, particularly to do with the protection of the natural environment, just being one example, but then making sure that, that conversation continues to move forward in a positive light.
Thank you so much. And thank you to both of you for sharing your time and your expertise with us. It was such a pleasure to exchange again with you on this important topic. To our listener, thank you for tuning in this episode. I hope you enjoy our discussion and stay tuned for coming IHL talks and related In and Around Wars episode.
You've been listening to In and Around Wars, a podcast of the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights. If you've enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned for more inspiring conversations. You can also check the Geneva Academy's website, geneva-academy.ch, to find more resources and upcoming events on contemporary issues of international humanitarian law and policy.